Hey everybody, it is 7:59 and we are live in Yvonne's sewing space. And so if you are here to do block 2 of the summer sampler, you're in the right place. I see there is at least 10 of you out there right now. Why don't you drop your name in the chat and tell me who you are and where you're from. We will start our class right at 8 o'clock. So if you are here watching us live, go ahead and tell us who you are tonight. We have Sonia from Michigan. Hi, Sonia. We have Baker's Acres from Ohio. We have Carolyn from Iowa. We have Lynn from Lexington. I'm Ivonne. I'm in Georgetown, Kentucky tonight. We have Carol from Canada, from British Columbia. Hi, Carol. We have Chris from Iowa. Welcome, Chris. All right, friends, it is 8 o'clock on the dot, so we are on time to get started. Okay, first thing that we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about our fabric, right? And we're going to talk about our block. So let me get my binder. So what I did is I took and I made a little binder because I like to be pretty organized with my stuff. And I went ahead and I put our block in here from last time. So I put my block that has the grid on it. And I also have tonight's block. So if you are new tonight, all of our blocks are listed on www.jellyrollclub.com. If you printed this in color, you're going to notice that this outside is blue and this inside is purple. So I'm going to rotate my camera down as I talk so I can show you how I'm going to pick out fabric for this particular block. And so if you are just joining us, please go ahead and say hello and drop your name in the chat and tell me where you're from. All right. So last time we were together, we created a block. And so our block that we made together looked just like this. And so that was last week's block. So I'm going to rotate this. So this was our block last week. And when we made our block, I told you to save everything that we had left over from our block. And so last time that we were together, we used 3 strips, 1 of background, 1 for this yellow, and then 1 entire jelly roll strip for this outside sashing for our block. But we had a few little pieces left over, and so let me take this out of the way. So I want you to take those pieces from last time, and I want you to put those to good use because guess what? You can put them in today's block. And this is the 2 little pieces I had on the end. And I actually made a tiny hourglass block out of that. And I'm going to save that for later. But you have 4 pieces that we had left over from last week. And I want you to get those out. And once you have them, I'm going to show you how I'm going to pick color for this block tonight. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my jelly roll out. Because this is the jelly roll that I'm using. This is Darlene's Favorites. I love this line. I just think it's beautiful. It's by Robert Kauffman. It's a nice high quality jelly roll. And then I'm going to take my pattern out and I'm going to flip it over so that I can start deciding on what colors I want. This border on here is actually a blue border. This is a dark purple, a light purple, and a goldy yellow. How did I pick these colors for this block? Well, I love using a color wheel for picking out my colors. And so if I take my color wheel and I put this star on purple, I can see that some of the colors that go really well with purple are over here, which is gold, or this goldy yellow. Other colors that would go well with purple are in the orange or red family, orangey red, and something in the aqua, green, or teal family. And so these are the things that I'm going to keep in mind when I pick my 3 jelly roll strips. I already have gold. because I have these left over from last time. So I'm going to use these 4 pieces left over in these 4 spots. Next, I'm going to pick out a color for the outside. So I think I'm going to pick a really nice blue. In this case, my jelly roll has blues and purples. And I'm just going to pick out a blue that I think will coordinate nicely. And I'm going to pick this blue with little daisies. And so this is going to be my outside. Right? So I'm going to set this aside. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick out from my jelly roll a purple that I like. And it looks like this has like a medium purple that I'm going to use. And so I'll pull out this purple. And this pattern is also showing a lighter purple. And so I can use 2 different purples out of my jelly roll. I have a lighter purple and a darker purple. So I'm going to have a light one. So now I have a light and a medium that I like. And I'm going to use my leftover strips from last time. But now I have background out here. And so for that, I'm just going to use a white strip, or I can pick something else out of my jelly roll that I might want to use. But it doesn't really matter. You decide how you want to do it. I have some of these jelly roll strips. Sometimes jelly roll strips come with colors that are basically white. And so I'm going to pull this one out of here that has just a tiny bit of blue in it, because I think that'll make a very cute background. Your jelly roll may be different, so you decide what you want to do. Not all jelly rolls are alike. Some of them are extremely long. This particular jelly roll is extremely long. And so these pieces go on and on and on. And you'll learn once you start using jelly rolls that not every jelly roll is the same. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer, and some of them are actually even just a tiny bit wider than 2.5 inches. So you really have to kind of measure and be careful. This particular jelly roll strip here, I'm going to measure it first before I get started. And it is actually a full 45 inches long. So this is longer than a traditional jelly roll strip, which is usually somewhere between 42 and 44. All right, when you have your strips ready, please let me know and we will continue. So we have Anita from South Carolina. We have Lorraine from Florida. Hi, Lorraine. We have Joy from Prince George, British Columbia in Canada. And we have Lily from North Bay, Ontario. Hi, friends. Welcome. Welcome to the Jelly Roll Club. Okay, so you really only need 3 strips. If you don't want to use all the colors that I've used, that's fine. This is your block. You could actually make this entire block with just 1 jelly roll strip. So if you wanted this to be just the same, you could. You could make this solid so that these were the same color. So you don't have to provide the amount of variety I have on this block. But if you notice, this is blue, but on the screen it looks kind of purple. So you've got to watch stuff on a computer screen because sometimes colors are deceptive depending on whether you're on an iPad or a phone or a desktop. Okay, so let's get started and I'm going to break down the block for you. Okay. All right, so let's break down the block. So this is our block tonight. Some people call this Ohio Star, Variable Star, Sparkling Star. It has a lot of different names, but I'm going to break this block down for you into its subsets. If you notice, this block is made out of 4 4-patches. So this is 1 4-patch. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This has this line that goes vertically in the design and horizontally because I wanted to show you that these 4 units were identical. And now I'm going to show you how to kind of break this down. So if we're just looking at one of these units, I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to draw, because we're going to make 4 identical units. And I'm going to draw a kind of a heavy line on mine so that you can see what we're talking about. So I'm going to draw this line with a pencil. So last time I tried to use a marker, it wouldn't show. And so there we go. So this is the unit that we're talking about. We're going to build this unit here in the corner 4 times. So I saved these from last time. I'm going to need one of these for this half square triangle. It's in the middle because mine is going to be yellow and white. So mine is going to be yellow and white, and I have to trim this down to fit. So I'm going to set this aside. And this is left over from last time. Now I have to figure out how many half square triangles I need in which color combination. So in this case, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 that have a lighter color. So I'm going to have to cut those out. And so I need 4 of this one. And I'll just write that down in the corner. I need 4 of that one. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Do you see how many I've got here? So I've got 2 in each quadrant. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I need 8. And I'm going to write that down. I need 8 of these blocks that are white and purple. So I need 4 that look like this, and I need 8 that look like this. I also need 4 more that are going to be in this middle part. Mine are going to be yellow and white, and yours may be a different color. So I need a total of 16 pieces. So I've broken down my block, and I know that I need to have 16 pieces total, and I'm going to put these together in these units like this, where I'm sewing these 4 pieces together, and then I'm going to combine 1, 2, 3, 4 of those units. Now, last time we were together, I showed you how to take a strip. So last time we were together, I showed you how to take a strip and sew 1/4 of an inch on either side of that, and then cut it using a square ruler. However, this time, because we're not using an entire strip and we're not making 16 units of the same color, I'm going to show you how to do it in a slightly different way. So let's get started. Let me know when you're ready to continue, okay? So I've got my jelly roll strips now, and I'm ready to go. I'm going to see my table. And so the first one that I'm going to do is this blue, okay? I know that my outside sashing, this is my outside sashing, needs to be 8.5 inches on 2 sides. So I'm going to start by cutting my sashing. So this inside block finishes 8.5 by 8.5. So I'm going to cut this section right here that goes across the top and then across the bottom as an 8.5. And this class is a sew along, so I hope that you are at home sewing with us too. So I did an 8.5 and an 8.5. So I'm going to cut those first. And so I'm just going to take my handy dandy ruler. And if you don't have a great big long ruler and you can't cut 8.5, this is an 8.5 ruler, so I can do it. But you can cut this with any type of ruler. So let's say that you only had a small square ruler. You can actually fold this in half and cut it so that it was 8.5. So you could do them 4 1/4. And I always start from my selvage edge. Trim off my selvage. And then I can begin sewing. When you work with jelly roll strips, so you see all of these cutters that I have a 60 millimeter, I have a 45 millimeter, and then I have this little guy, which is a 28. Whenever I'm working with jelly rolls, I prefer to use my little guy because it just makes it safer, less likely that I'm going to chop off the end of my finger. So I'm just going to trim that off. It's 2 layers thick. And now I want that to be 8.5 inches. So I'm going to find a ruler that I can use that's 8.5 inches, and I'm going to make my next cut. I'm going to take this. This is 8.5. And I'm going to line this up. There's a line right here on my ruler. I'm going to line those edges up. And if they're not together, you can just take and tickle it with your fingers like this. If you tickle that, they go back to where they belong. So I just kind of play with my fingers a little bit. And now I'm ready to go. So I'm going to take that, line it up with one of those lines along here so that it's really straight. And I'm going to cut that 8.5 inches. So now this one is ready to go. I'm going to take the remainder of my strip, and I'm not going to cut it 8.5 inches. I'm just going to cut it in half. So I'm going to take my scissors, and I'm literally going to cut it in half. But first I'm going to measure it before I start cutting it. I want to know how wide this strip is. And you can use a ruler to measure it. You can use your cutting mat to measure it, or you can use a tape measure. I love my big, ginormous 120-inch tape measure because it lets me measure my quilt with accuracy. And so I'm just going to lay this on here, and I want to see how long is this piece. And this is 13 inches, so I'm just going to cut it in half. Just like this, stick my scissor in there. And these are now ready to go. So I have my 2 pieces that go on the top and the bottom of my block, and my 2 pieces that go on the 2 sides once I am done to border my block. So I've got these ready. I'm going to set them aside. Okay. Now I'm going to prepare I'm going to pull out my pattern, and I'm going to prepare the 4 pieces for the outside corner. So I'm going to need a total of 4 half square triangles. I'm going to take this strip because I'm going to use it with this color, and I'm also going to use it with this color. I'm going to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to take this here, and I'm going to pull out my handy dandy square ruler we used last time. And I'm going to put this right sides together. So I'm going to drop these down on top of each other. And I'm going to tickle them together so that they are nice and even on the sides. And I'm going to take my little tiny ruler I used last time, and I'm going to cut out 4 pieces that are ready for me to sew together. So I'm going to take this here. And I see my selvage, so I'm going to chop it off, because you always want to get rid of that selvage. And now here's for the part that we're going to do. So you're going to take your little ruler like this, and you can use a little ruler that's a square. You can use even a larger ruler as long as it has a 45-degree line. So it doesn't really matter. As long as your ruler has a 45-degree line somewhere, you can use it. You can even use a ruler like this one as long as you can see that 45-degree line. So let's pretend that all you have is this ruler here. So I'm going to take this ruler, and I have a 45-degree line, and I'm going to lay that right on the edge of this strip set, right where I chopped off that selvage. And I'm going to make my first cut at a 45-degree angle. So this is lined up with the bottom of that jelly roll strip, nice and straight. There's 2 jelly roll strips together, pretty side to pretty side, and I'm going to make a cut. And these are just waste, so you can keep them. You can turn them into something else if you want to, but these are actually what I used to make this little hourglass guy. I saved mine and used those. So if you want to do what I do and save little blocks, you can. Okay, so now I have my strip set. I have 2 pieces facing each other, and I have a 45-degree angle. So now I'm going to take this ruler, and I'm going to slide. You see my line? I'm going to slide this over until I am approximately 1/4 of an inch up here at the top away from that edge. And I'm going to go ahead and make a cut. And so I have 2 triangles. Then I'm going to take, and I'm going to do it on the opposite side. I had this lined up here, right? And I just cut it. So now I'm going to slide my ruler. I'm going to rotate it. And I'm going to put that 45-degree line on that side. And I'm going to scooch it over, scooch it down, scooch it down, scooch it down until I have 1/4 of an inch. And let me see if you can see that. Can you guys see right there? I have about 1/4 inch of fabric. So from this tip, I'm going to come in 1/4 of an inch, and I can mark it with a pencil if I wanted to. I'm going to come in about 1/4 of an inch, and this is where I want to land. So right about there. And I'm going to take this ruler, again, taking that 45-degree line that you see, and it says 45 degrees on mine. I'm lining that up with the bottom right there, and then I'm scooching that over until I have 1/4 of an inch hanging off of this side, and then I'm going to take my ruler and my rotary cutter and make sure that it's nice and straight, and I'm going to give it a little chop. And so now I have 2. I'm going to do the same thing. You want to do it with your little square ruler, same thing. You put that right on the bottom. You line that up with the edge, make sure that it's straight. Line that up with the bottom. Scooch it so where you have 1/4 of an inch hanging off of that end, and then you're going to give it a chop. And you're going to do that a total of 4 times. Because you're not using the entire strip, you're going to save that strip for something else down the road. And you don't want to cut fabric to just have it sit around. So I'm going to take the same thing. I'm going to put it right on that edge. I'm going to line it up with this edge. I'm going to put that 45-degree line right on the edge of that. I'm going to scooch that over until there's 1/4 of an inch hanging off of this end. And then I'm chopping it again. How are we doing so far? How are we doing so far? So somebody asked the question. They said, my block is only 12 inches. I'm going to stop for questions so that you guys can get caught up. So somebody said, my block is only 12 inches, not 12.5. That usually happens when you're using 1/4 of an inch that's a little bit on the fat side. When you sew, your machine has a 1/4 of an inch line. You want to be just on the outside of that. So let me give you an example. So like when you're sewing and you see this little square, I'm going to pull this out. Anytime that you're sewing, you're wanting to sew with what's called a scant quarter. So this on my ruler is 1/4 of an inch. So when you're sewing, instead of basically sewing directly on that line, you want to sew towards this side so that your 1/4 of an inch is just a little bit smaller. That way, when you open that seam and you press, you lose a tiny, tiny bit of fabric. And let me show you with a block. So let me show you this little block here, right? I have sewn this with 1/4 of an inch seam. And when I press with my seam to the side, which I will, and I open that up, this little fold of fabric here causes me to lose a little bit of width. So if I sew with a fat quarter, which means a little bit bigger than 1/4 of an inch, and I'm multiplying that across 6 seams, then I'm losing a tiny bit every time. And so my block will end up being not exactly 8.5 for the inner block and not exactly 12.5 for the outer block. Am I making sense? And so when you sew and you're a new sewer, make sure that your 1/4 of an inch is what's called a scant quarter. And if I lay my ruler right on there, you're going to see, if you can see really close, and I take my stiletto here, when I look down right at this block, my stitching line is just to the outside. So it's not exactly at this quarter, it's just to this side of the quarter. And so that's just important to remember. Now you don't want that stitch line to be too skinny and be like 1/8 of an inch, but you definitely want to sew with what's called a scant 1/4 of an inch. And as long as all of your seams are consistent and all of your blocks end up being 12 inches, you know what? That's okay too. That's okay too. All right, so let's go back to the cutting again. So somebody said they had a question about the cutting. So let's go back to cutting the 4 pieces because I'm getting ready to cut my next color. So let's show you what we've got so far. So let's go back to our block. My block, let's just repeat what we did. My block is going to be put together in quadrants. So I have a 4 patch that has 1, 2, 3, 4. I need 2 half square triangles that are purple and white, one that is yellow and another color, and then one that's a light purple and a white. So I'm making 4 of these units right here. So in order to do that, I cut these little half square triangle combos that look like this, and then I'm going to go over to my sewing machine to sew them. How you make these, and I'm going to trim them from the other side so you can see that again. So I'm going to take the other side of my strip, and I have not sewn the 2 sides together yet. I haven't, because I don't want to use this entire strip. So I'm going to take, and I'm going to tease these together. I'm going to repeat that just so you can see it. And I'm going to trim off the selvage. Then with my 2 strips, one on top of the other, right sides together, because I want pretty side to pretty side. Pretty side to pretty side. I'm going to take that line right here, that's my 45, and I'm going to line that up with the bottom of my ruler, and I'm going tip to top like this. And this is on the 45, and I'm going to come across here and I'm going to trim this off. Just like that. This is my discard because these are too small to make a 2.5 inch half square triangle, but these are big enough that if I save these 4 little trimmings, I can make an hourglass. And so that's what I'm going to do later. And I'm going to save these for the end of my summer sampler series. But this is your first cut. And then I'm going to line this up right along that edge, and I'm going to trim. So I'm lining up my 45 degrees, and I'm going to trim, and I'm leaving like a little bit, like a 1/4 of an inch up there at the top. Okay. And if your blocks are not exactly 12.5 inches, don't panic. Do not redo everything. You're going to measure all your blocks at the end, and you're going to trim them up so that they're all the same, so that they match. Or you can add a little bit more. As long as you're consistent and you use the same sewing machine, your blocks are all going to end up the same because we're working with a grid that is 4 by 4. So all of the blocks that we're doing in the series are 4 across and 4 down. So as long as your seams are the same every single time, then all your blocks should be close to the same size, and that should be just fine. So please do not panic and do not redo your blocks. There's no sense in that. Okay, so I have now all of these little pieces, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew them right now. So I've got my sewing machine ready. It's threaded. I'm using medium gray thread so you can see my seam allowances, but I want you to go ahead and go to your sewing machine and sew those 4 little bits that we just cut. And you're going to sew just like this, pretty side to pretty side, and you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch away. Now this one can be a fat quarter, it doesn't matter because these are oversized and we're going to trim them down. So go ahead and sew 1/4 of an inch all the way down. And if you have questions about anything that I'm doing, please let me know so that I can slow down. My goal is to make this a sew along so that you are sewing at the same time that I'm sewing. And so that when we are done with this class at the end of the night, you have a block that's finished. Quilters are notoriously hard on themselves and sometimes to the point of perfectionism. Don't make your hobby something that stresses you out. Quilting should be enjoyable. And so never ever stress about mistakes in your quilting. And never stress if your quilt pieces are not the same as other people's. It's fine. So I just sew without breaking my thread because that saves thread. And then when I'm done, I take a little piece of fabric that I saved. It's called a leader or an ender. And I stick it under my presser foot. And I zip right through. And the reason I do that is because that saves a ton of thread. If you take and you pull 6 inches of thread every time you sew one of these pieces, then what would happen is you would end up wasting a ton of thread. And I don't like to do that. So now you should have a little curtain that looks like this with all your little half square triangles. And so we're going to set those aside because we're going to press and iron them all at the same time. So now let's look at our block again. Let's look at our block again. So now I have 4 little pieces that look like a string, like this, right? My little half square triangles for these outsides. I have my little yellow and whites that were left over from last time because I don't like wasting fabric. So I have those and I have these. And I can just check them off if I want to. So sometimes that's a good thing if you want to check them off on a pattern and say, okay, I have these 4, so I'm going to go check, 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 check. I have those. I'm going to check this one, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now the only thing that I have left are these on the outside. Well, I know that I need 8 of those. Last time that we sewed, we made 16 of those out of 1 jelly roll strip. So now I'm going to take my purple jelly roll strip that looks just like this, the one I picked out, and I'm going to cut it in half. So I'm going to take my entire jelly roll strip, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm just going to fold it in half, and I'm going to snip it with my scissors. Just like that. And so now this is a strip that's only a half of a jelly roll strip. And I'm going to save that for another block. Now, same thing that we did last time, friends. We're going to take this strip here that's a half a strip, and I'm going to match it up, and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side. But this time, I'm going to take what's left of this right here, and I'm going to pair it up with this one. And so I have at least a half a strip. I'm going to square up that end. Actually, I'm not even going to square up that end. I'm just going to let it hang off like this. And I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side and make a tube just like I did last time. And then I'm going to have a little tail left over, and that's fine. So I'm going to square that up. And I'm going to sew like the wind because I'm going to put 1/4 of an inch on either side. So I'm going to just trim it square. because that helps me to stay straight. So there it is. Pretty side to pretty side. Face the nice sides together, and then bring it over to your sewing machine and sew. Now, these little pinked edges can throw people off. I always measure to the outside of that pinked edge when I'm sewing 1/4 of an inch. And so whether you sew to the inside of that pinked edge or to the outside of that pinked edge as your guide, that's up to you, as long as you're consistent. In quilting, the most important thing is being consistent. So even if you're off, as long as you do the same thing always and you're consistent, 9 out of 10 times you're going to be okay. Does anyone have any questions? And I'll be glad to answer any questions. I will stop in just a second. But I'm going to just line these up with my fingers like this and tease them. And then I will sew that. If you notice, I moved my table over here. And I brought my little table from downstairs. Just makes it easier for me. I'm going to trim this extra off because I don't need it. And I'm just teasing that with my fingers. And I'm lining that up, making sure that I have 1/4 inch. If you're a new quilter, one of the biggest investments you can make for yourself is 1/4 inch foot. 1/4 inch foot is a foot so where your needle and the edge of that foot are 1/4 inch apart. And put a little bit of tape or painter's tape along that 1/4 inch line so that you can keep big long strips nice and straight. Like I said, I always use a leader and an ender, and I never break my thread. All right. Zipping right along. Someone asked me last time what kind of thread I use. I use 2 types of thread, and let me show you what kind of thread I use. The question is, should we sew each one of the stitching lines in opposite directions to avoid stretching the strips? Yes. Yes. Is there a right or wrong way to use the seam ripper, such as less harm to the fabric? Yes and no. I never pull my fabric, and let me show you what I mean by that. And I'll just take the seam ripper. If you're going to seam rip something, let me show you really quick. If you're going to seam rip something, I always take my piece and then I kind of open it just barely like this, and I separate that so that I can see. And see how I can separate that, and it just popped open. And so without pulling at all, that loosens that thread. And so I'm just going to take my fingernail and pull at it just a hair like that. And what that does by loosening that, now I can come in here with my seam ripper. My seam ripper has a name. His name is Jack. Jack the Ripper, the seam ripper. So Jackie is not my friend. I don't like him, but I use him if I need to. And so I've pulled that thread loose just a hair with my fingernail, not causing that any stress. And I'm going to come in, and about every other stitch, I'm just going to pop it just like that. And I'm going to hold the thread between my fingers like this, because I'm not pulling on my fabric that way. And I'm making sure that I'm only grabbing thread like that. And then I fold it again, and I'm only grabbing thread, making sure not to rip my fabric. You have to be very easy. And just like that, and I pop that stitch. And so now what that does is I'm able to take this piece and just gently, ever so gently, pull it apart. And see those little holes in your fabric? Once you press that, those are going to be gone, so it's fine. And so that's how you prevent yourself from distorting. I try not to seam rip as much as possible. If that means that all of my blocks are going to be a little bit smaller, or as long as my points match, then I'm good to go. And 9 out of 10 times my points match because I use a consistent seam. Does anybody have any other questions? And your questions have been very good so far. Yes, when you sew a long strip, you want to sew one direction and then the other. The same is true if you're sewing things like in a circle. So you see this here, like this block here that's a circle, and it has a lot of seams. When I stitched them together, I stitched this way, and then this way, and this way. And I sewed those in opposite directions so that those would be consistent seams all the way around. And so, yes, that is a very good question. All right. So you have one half strip that's sewn like a tube. You have 4 little half square triangles, and then you have the 4 leftovers from last time. So that's what we have here. And now I also have my sashing strips. So now I'm ready to show you how to cut your little tube. So now you have your little tube again. So I'm going to pull this camera up. And so you're going to do the same thing that we did before. So let me scooch these guys over. Start on either side. It doesn't really matter because we need to get a total of 8 pieces out of here because our pattern said that we needed 8 of these. So I'm going to cut 8 of these before I start putting my blocks together. So I'm going to do it just like we did before. And if you notice, the seam over here is a little bit fat. It doesn't matter. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to lay that line right on my stitch line. There's no selvage on here. So I'm going to lay that right on the stitch line right there. And I'm going to lay this right here, right on the stitch line exactly. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to do this first cut. Goodbye. So now I have a 45-degree angle and a blunted edge. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to lay it here right on that stitch line and I'm going to scooch that over. Can you guys see that? Until I have this on my stitch line and that edge of this side of my thing is kissing that stitching line. And then I'm going to go back like this and give it a cut. And so I should have a half square triangle that's already stitched together, just like this. And I'm going to do that a total of 8 times. So I'm going to take, and I flip this over to make it easier for me so that I don't cut myself. So you always want to use your rotary cutter away from your body. You don't want to, and you want to close it. You want to make sure that you're cutting away from yourself, because if you try to come in with a rotary cutter and cut like this, you could accidentally hit your hand. You could take the end of your finger. I've seen people do that. So try not to ever cut towards you. Always cut away from you. It just makes it safer. And so you're going to see me adjust that so that I can cut safely. My next cut, same thing. I'm going to lay this right on the stitch line. I'm going to scooch this so that you can see. This edge right here is touching my stitch line on the opposite side. So this is going to go straight, so I'm not crooked here. And I can see that this line is straight, so I'm using one of the lines over here to make sure it's straight. Stitch line to stitch line. And straighten it up. And then I'm going to give her a little cut. And this is a very forgiving technique because you trim these up. And so if these are a little bit oversized or a little bit wonky, it doesn't matter. Once we press and trim, those are going to match up. And so there we go till we get to the bottom. I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to keep repeating the same thing a total of 8 times. I'm going stitch line to stitch line. Some people will say not to cut towards you, and they are right. And so line it up, stitch line again, stitch line to stitch line. If you're concerned that you're going to wobble your ruler, you can line this up with the bottom. So for example, if I wanted to line up that 45-degree with the pinked edge, I could do that as well. As long as I could get that tip to line up with that stitch line, I'm good. So I could line it up like this, so where it's stitch line and then this is lined up against the bottom. That works as well. As long as you're getting that stitch line to stitch line in that 45-degree angle, these are all going to be the same size. So where are we here? So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Getting close. How are you guys doing with your cutting? Are you coming along? Do you have any questions? I love sewing with jelly rolls. Jelly roll sewing is like one of my favorite things in the whole wide world. And so I'm just going to keep cutting till I get all the way to the end. You will not waste any fabric in this sampler if I can help it. So there's a little wobble in that strip right there. But as soon as I press it, that little wobble will go away. One of the things that you'll notice is that I'm not spraying my pieces and I'm not starching my pieces. Some people love to starch their pieces to death. I find that it makes them much harder to match up those seams later if you you starch your pieces to the point where they're like cardboard. So I do not starch and press my pieces to death. It distorts them. So I'm not a steamer. I use a hot dry iron. So if you're ever wondering about that. So I have 8 of these. I'm going to put them into 4 piles now because I have 4 quadrants. So because my block is in 4 quadrants, I'm going to put these in 4 piles. So I'm going to have pile 1, pile 2, pile 3, and pile 4. And I'm going to snip these off from each other. Seam ripper is great for that, just to break those seams. So I need 1 of those in each pile. And that's just to kind of help me make sure that I have everything I need. And then I need 2 in each pile of my purple and background. And so once I have that, I have 16 pieces. And so there you go. I have 1 of these. 1, 2, 4. So I have 4 in each pile. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 and 4. So now I have my 4 little piles and I can save these for next time. So I'll use those again. I'm saving this little leftover and I'm saving all of these little trimmings because at the end I'm going to keep using everything that's left from my jelly roll. I don't want to waste anything. Does anyone have any questions about what we've covered so far in this block? It says, are you lining up with the 2 or 2.5 or 3 on the ruler? I'm just having a hard time seeing it. I'm going to, Anita, I'm going to trim all of my blocks to 2.5 inches. So I will use this little guy right here. That's a 2.5-inch ruler from Creative Grids. And I will use this to square up all of these little half square triangles because everything on the inside in here, each one of these is 2.5 inches before you sew them. So trim all of these to 2.5 then put all 16 together. So let me show you how that works, okay? All right, so I'm going to get my little pressing mat and let's talk about pressing. Pressing is the hardest thing to learn when you're a quilter because you're not ironing. It's not like ironing your clothes. And so when you are quilting, and I use a wool pressing mat for mine. I use a wool pressing mat because it absorbs moisture and it absorbs heat, and it does a really nice job. So I've got my blocks and I'm going to start pressing mine. So this is like a very inexpensive Proctor Silex. Walmart does not shut off iron. So I have my baby iron and I have this one. And I always press with my dark side to the top. And I don't like to use steam. Sometimes people borrow my iron and put water in it. They should never do that. But I do not like to use steam at all. I'm just pressing that because I find that it creates a lot of distortion. So first I set my seam in its entirety. And setting your seam means you're just taking those stitches and you're causing them to shrink and anchor themselves into your fabric. So that's what I'm doing. It says leftover water. I'm going to dump this water out. Somebody has borrowed my iron, and I'm going to dump water out of it because I do not like water at all. No water at all. It causes fabric to pucker, and it can cause a lot of issues. Fabric already comes with sizing. If you buy good fabric, name brand fabrics such as Moda, Robert Kauffman, Riley Blake, most of them come with a decent amount of sizing, and so you really don't need to spray them to death. And it makes it harder to match seams. If you put too much starch or sizing on your pieces, it really makes it hard to have perfect points. And I'm obsessed with perfect points. I'll give you an example of perfect points. So if you look at this block here, it was made with jelly roll strips. And if you want those points like that to match exactly like those do, see how nicely they go? There is no starch on this block at all. It's just this natural sizing that came in there. And this one is called Joy Box. And so I like my blocks to my points to match. And because I want my points to match in places that are crucial like this, I tend to avoid starch. And if you notice, if you pull that apart, that is a perfect four-way match right there. So nope, very little starch. I just use what's in the fabric. So save yourself some money and aggravation by not starching everything to death. And there you go, setting the rest of those seams. I just lay my iron. You're trying to use a light touch with your iron, not a heavy scrubbing motion. If you take and you just scrub your pieces to death like this, what you end up doing is just distorting them. Now that I have set all of those seams, now I'm going to pop them open. So I will lay them like this. And I literally, because this is a bias edge here, and this is a little bit of a bias edge, I don't want to distort them. So I just want to peel them back and let the hot iron do its work. And I just let my iron sit for a second. So I don't want to scrub like that. That's not really a good thing. Then I'm just going to lay them flat. Now, some people will use a clapper, or you can just lay something wooden if you have something wooden on your blocks like this. I have that little wooden board, but you can lay something heavy like a book on those, and it'll make them good and flat. You just wait till they cool down before you start handling them. And so I put my iron on them. I just let it sit for a second. I grab the next piece, let it sit for a second. Grab the next piece, let it sit for a second. And that's all you need to do, and you just keep going until you finish your entire stack. because these are going to get trimmed up and squared up. So if they're not 100% perfect, I'm not too concerned right now. So let's look at the questions. It says, right now while you were cutting the triangles, while I was cutting the triangles, I wasn't lining up to any particular number. I was just using the edges of the ruler, and I will show you that in just a second. Let me finish pressing these. Set my iron right on top of that pile and keep opening these. I just use a very hot, very dry iron. All right. Almost done with all of my pressing. And I'll be ready to put my blocks together. So I'm almost done here. Just have a few more because I need a total of 16 squares. Always to the dark side. That way you get less shadowing when you finish your quilt and you don't have those dark seams showing up. Just makes for a nicer finished quilt. Okay, there we go. So now we have our little pile and they're ready to trim. So I have all of my little blocks. Again, I'm going to try to keep them separated into my little groups. So I have one yellow in each one because I'm trying to keep them in quadrants. I have one light purple in each pile. And then I have two of these in each pile. Did I lose a little block somewhere? There's one. I lost a little block. This is why we count to make sure you have enough. They can go astray in your sewing room, people. Especially if your sewing room gets messy, like I get messy sometimes. I start throwing stuff all over a table behind me sometimes. There we go. So I have my 16. So I have 4, 4, 4, and 4. So I have my 16 blocks. Okay, so let's look at what we've got here. What should this measure? So let's do a little bit of math. If this is 2.5 by 2.5 before I start sewing, when I get this one and this one sewn together, this entire unit of 2, 2.5 and 2.5, subtract a 1/2 inch from here. So this should be 2.5 and 2.5 is 5. And if I subtract that 1/2 inch for those two seams right there, this little unit should be 4.5 inches. That means that each of these quadrants that I'm working on should measure 4.5 by 4.5 before I put them together. So I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 by 4.5 units. All right, so I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this little square just right here that we're working on. So this is what we're going to work on first in 4s. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and this little unit will measure 4.5 by 4.5. So let's go ahead and get to trimming, and then we're going to go over to the sewing machine and sew these little 4 patches together. So now I'm going to move my wool ironing mat. Super handy dandy little guy. If you use a lot of water it can leak through your wool mat and it can start to smell weird. It smells like wet dog. Nobody wants to smell wet dogs in their sewing room, so I avoid getting my little wool mat wet. Does anybody else have any questions? You feel like you got the hang of this? Practice makes perfect. How's everybody doing so far? You want to give me a thumbs up? Let me know you're doing okay. I'm going to start trimming my little piles. And these will go a little bit faster each time we sew because this is going to become second nature. By the time we're done with all of these blocks, you're going to be like, wow, that was easy. Right now it feels awkward because you're learning a new skill. The human brain requires repetition. It takes 25 to 50 times before of repeating an activity before a person completely acquires a new skill and commits it to long-term memory. Because I'm a teacher by trade, and so I understand that learning takes time. There's also brain-based learning that says that if you don't do something with enough frequency, you also forget it, which is why we're doing our Jelly Roll Summer Sampler every Sunday night. Because just when your brain is starting to forget what we did last Sunday, boom, here we are again, and we are repeating that skill, and so you're going to know how to do this so easy, lickety split. All right, so let me show you what I'm doing here. I'm taking a little 2.5-inch square ruler that I have, and I'm trimming these little blocks to 2.5 inches square before I put them together. So I'm working on pile 1. You can also trim them with a ruler like this. So let's say you have a little ruler like this that's bigger. I can line this up. I can nip these little bunny ears off. And it's easier when you're trimming to nip those off. And I can take the 45-degree line on this ruler, and I can take the 2.5-inch lines. See, this one is 2.5 inches right there, and I can actually line that up with my 45, my 2.5-inch line this way, and I can trim it like this, and then I can measure 2.5 inches the other way and then trim it the other way. So if you didn't have a tiny ruler like this, you can. I like rulers like this, so this one has a 2.5-inch line this way and this way. So if I wanted to, I could lay that 2.5-inch line across this way, and then just trim 2 sides off. That's another way of also doing it. So this is a very forgiving activity. One of my favorite things to use in my sewing room when I'm trimming little blocks like this is a tiny little self-healing mat. So this is like a little tiny little mat. Sometimes you see them in scrapbook stores, but it's little, and so you can rotate your blocks and never have to move them. So if I needed to rotate this to cut it, I could just use this tiny little mat and not have to buy one of those expensive rotating mats. So if I wanted to take this like this, and it's all cattywampus, and I needed to trim it everywhere, I could center that right there. And I know that this is the line I need, so I could actually take this and just trim it, just like this. Then I can rotate that and trim. If I wanted to trim on all 4 sides, some people like doing that. Just rotate it each direction without having one of those expensive rotating mats. Those things can be quite high. Sometimes they're $50, $60, but a little mat like this might cost you just $4 or $5 if you buy them on sale. And so anytime you can, save money. So these little things like this from a craft store also work. It's a self-healing mat, and it says self-healing, and cutting is for pounding and jewelry making. You can find these everywhere. This is maybe a little over 3.5 inches across, and not quite 6 inches long. It's about 5, so it's nice for trimming little things. So there we go. You have 4 pieces now, trimmed to 2.5 inches, and I'm going to grab my pattern right over here, and I'm going to try to lay out one of my quadrants. I know that this yellow is going this way to the outside. I'm going to put this purple down like this, and this is going to make a type of hourglass. I'm going to lay this out this way, and then I'm going to lay this like this. So my quadrant will end up looking like this, and I have to make this a total of 4 times. So I'm going to have this little thing that looks like an hourglass, this yellow, and this is going to be, for my purposes, one of these squares. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew these. So I'm going to lay them like this, and then I'm going to flip straight over, and I'm going to sew them on this side. And so that's the reason I put them together and lay them out, so that when I go to the sewing machine, I won't get confused. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these like this. These are now 2.5 inches and 2.5 inches. This is exactly the order in which I need to sew them. If you want to, some people will put a clip. So if you have these little clips, you can always mark, okay, I need to sew on this side, so that you don't lose track of what side you're sewing on. Because if you sew these, if you get them turned around and you sew on the wrong side, then all of a sudden your block is not going to match, and you're going to have to talk to Jack the Ripper. And he's not my friend. I don't like him. So I'm going to go over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew my next little square. So let's go. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to sew my 2 guys without stopping. All right. And I'm not breaking my thread at all. So let me show you what I mean by that. So I have my thread, and I'm not detaching that. Why? Because I'm going to leave those guys alone. And now I can just leave them just like this and flip them over. What that does is it prevents me from getting these in the wrong order. So I know that I need to sew them like this. So I'm just going to flip that over. And then I'm going to take those seams. And if you notice, I haven't pressed. And I'm going to push them in opposite directions. So I'm going to take this. And this is another reason why I don't use a bunch of starch. I'm going to take my fingernail. I'm just going to flatten that seam. And I'm going to take my nail this way, and I'm going to flatten my seam. And then I'm going to put those so where those seams are going in opposite directions. And when that does, those will nest perfectly. So I match them right in the middle. Sometimes I do put a pin just to make sure that those 2 little guys stay where they belong. But you don't have to pin it because you can feel it. If those 2 seams are nested, that's what they look like. You can feel that. You can take that to the sewing machine and get it cut. Some people love to pin because it helps them to be more accurate. You do whatever works for you. I'm just showing you one way. It's not the only way. It's not the most correct way. It's just one way of doing it. I've been quilting for 35 years, so if you see me do something and it looks easy, you're like, wow, look at her. I've been sewing for a long time, and so some things come easy for me that may not come so easy. And so when I open that, I have a perfect point right there, and that's what I want. And so now I'm not going to press those seams because I want those to be able to lay down. And so I'm going to take that and I'm going to let that little seam open just a hair so that that seam will lay flat. So I'm going to see there's one little stitch right there that's holding that. I'm going to take my seam ripper and I'm going to come in here, and you have to be very careful when you do this. See how there's stitching? Can you see that? That goes from this seam onto the outside. I'm going to break the outside stitching just a hair, one of those stitches, just one. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to swirl that seam. I want that to lay flat. And so this seam is going to go this way. And now this other seam can go the opposite way. And the reason I do that is because I want there to be less bulk in the middle right here. Because otherwise you have tons of fabric that just meets right there in the center. So I just barely pull that apart. I'm going to try to mush that. I'm going to carefully tease it. It's like dissecting that seam a little bit. Just a hair. And then I'm going to mush that open. So there we go. It should look like a tiny little 4-patch right there in the middle. And I'm going to take my finger and I'm just going to mush it right there. And why am I doing that is because I want that. Do you see it looks like a little tiny 4-patch? When I flip it and I press it, that won't be a giant lump right there because I don't want that to be lumpy. And so I'm going to take and I'm going to press that now. And I have built 1/4 of my block. And I'm going to let those seams go opposite directions so that these will go down. So I'm going to let those seams go where they want to go. And I'm going to come over here and press from the front. In my tiny little block. Should look like this, like a little hourglass. And these blocks are small, but you can do it. If you feel like your block is not quite straight, you can just lay the iron on there. These are very forgiving. Make sure that you're not pressing any weird little tucks or puckers. I just try to make mine as straight as possible. So I turn it when I press it, and I leave my iron to set because I'm trying to basically block it and keep it nice and straight. There's a tiny bit over here. It might have stretched a hair, but otherwise, let's look at it. And so I'm going to look at this block now, and I'm going to check to see that it's 4.5 inches. So I'm going to pull a little ruler of mine, and this is 4.5 inches across. So I'm going to check to make sure that this is 4.5 inches. And I'm going to make sure that my block is straight. So that looks pretty straight. That looks pretty good. There's just a tiny sliver to trim over here. They're just hanging out. I'm going to flip it around and see if that's 4.5 inches on this side. Trying to line this up with the straight line here. And this is on the 4.5 inch line. And that looks pretty good. I think I have a tiny bit here that hangs out. So I'm going to try to line that up with the bottom, line that up with all the sides, and make sure that my little teeny tiny block is exactly 4.5 inches. There's a little nibble to take off. And so that was it. That was all that I trimmed, just a tiny bit. And now this is one of my units. I will have to build a total of 4 of these. So this is 1/4 of my block now. So now I need 3 more star legs. So this is one of my legs of my star. Does this make sense so far? All right. It is 9:14 and I think we can get the rest of this done. So now I'm going to lickety split, start trimming the rest of these really fast. And so I'm going to do the same thing and I'm going to repeat this a total of 4 times. So I'm going to take my next pile and I'm going to build my next one. You could assembly line sew these if you really wanted to and then lay them all out and sew them. But I just find that making sure that my subunits are all the correct size and then putting 4 of them together, my block just ends up extremely precise. And so it just makes, that's my choice. You don't have to do it this way. You can choose to do your blocks however you want to do your blocks. Anita and Lynn are my sewing partners, and they're probably tired because I've been sewing with them almost every single night this week. I think I've run them both into the ground. What do you think, Anita and Lynn? Lynn calls me the Energizer Bunny because I like to sew every single day. Sewing makes me happy. Sewing is my therapy, and sewing is what I enjoy to do. Now, super important thing to note, sewing and buying fabric are 2 different things. Quilting and buying fabric are 2 different hobbies. So if you are a fabric hoarder like me, that's one hobby. And then if you are a quilter like me, that's a whole different hobby. So I actually have 2 hobbies. Lynn said she's not tired, it keeps her going. Friends, if you are my friend and something happens to you and you cannot get to your sewing supplies, I will bring your sewing supplies to you, especially if you're within driving distance. I like to make sure that all of my friends have what they need. And so, yep, easy peasy lemon squeezy. I've got these 4. Like I said, it's so much easier when you have a tiny little cutting mat to turn your blocks. It just makes it super easy. Very accurate as long as you have a consistent seam. And it takes practice. So there's my next pile. And I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine because I want to make sure that when I sew my other pieces, they are all the same. So I'm just going to lay this over here on my sewing machine. And when I get over there to sew, I'm going to lay that as my reference. So I'm going to keep trimming. So I am using Darlene's Favorites by Robert Kauffman. It's a 1930s inspired fabric. What are you using for your blocks? Because you can see me on my end, but I can't see you on yours. It says, do you go to Zoom after? I couldn't find you last week. Yes, we will Zoom afterwards. If you go to the Jelly Roll Club Facebook page, it's at Jelly Roll Club. I will post a link immediately after this, and I will stay in Zoom if somebody has questions or needs individual help with their block. So if you go to at Jelly Roll Club in Facebook, I will post a Zoom immediately after this. I open a brand new Zoom and go in there and Zoom with you guys. We also Zoom on Saturday nights. So Saturday nights we have Zoom and Sew, which is kind of like sit and sew at your local quilt shop, except we do it on Zoom. We usually start around 7 or 8 o'clock at night, depending on what's going on at my house, because I have a lot of stuff going on at my house. I'm a mom of a college student. I have a granddaughter that lives with me. She's 3.5. I help my husband around the house. I cook. I'm a full-time teacher. And in my spare time, I obsess about quilting and I make quilty things. So I'm a busy person, but we always Zoom and sew on Saturday nights as many times as I can do that with my friends. So if you ever want to jump in there with us and just ask questions and see what we're doing, you can check out what's happening. Right now, we're working on a double wedding ring. So if you have been with us, we have been working on a double wedding ring. This one is one of my blocks that I've been working on. And yes, this is made with jelly rolls. So my double wedding ring has been keeping me busy. So this is one of my blocks. And this is with Little Ruby. This is all jelly roll pieces. So I love to jelly roll, people. I make lots and lots of quilts. Last time we were together, last Sunday when we started, people asked if, or I asked if we wanted to do a free motion quilt class. We were going to be doing a free motion quilt class on March the 20th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which is a Saturday afternoon. So if you see this quilt that's behind me, this is a jelly roll sampler also. So all of these blocks, the entirety of this quilt is made with jelly roll strips. The black is jelly roll strips. Every single tiny piece inside those baskets are jelly roll strips. And then the gray is also jelly roll strips. So even this one here is like 3 jelly roll strips. So this one is pieced. And so this is what I'm going to use. This is a twin. I'm going to do that to demonstrate free motion quilting for you guys. Once a month is when we have our live lessons on Zoom. So we Zoom a lesson once a month. So we have the double wedding ring, and that's in a series of 5 lessons. So if you go to our website, which is www.jellyrollclub.com, you can see the projects that we're working on in our monthly Zoom schedule. So we have Zoom classes, which are sew along style. We also have Zoom and Sews, where we just work on whatever we want to work on. And then we have special events or other projects, but the members of the Jelly Roll Club vote on what they want to sew, and then I work on those projects, and I write the patterns for the club and do all the calculations, and so that's how we work. We're just a bunch of quilting obsessed people who love to sew together. So Lily, you didn't miss a thing. And yes, I will Zoom after this with you if you need to ask questions. All right, so how's it going? How's it going out there? You guys almost done with your pieces? I'm almost done with mine. I sew a lot faster than your average bear because I'm always pressed for time. So I have learned to sew very, very fast. I love cutting fabric and trimming it. I find that this is very relaxing. It's probably one of my favorite things to do is to trim all my tiny little pieces. What's your favorite part of quilting? Who wants to share their favorite part of quilting? Do you like sewing? Do you like trimming? Do you like the quilting aspect of it? Do you send your tops away for somebody to do? What part of quilting do you like the most? I find piecing and trimming my blocks probably the most relaxing. I could do this for hours. I do this all night. All right. Almost done. Just one more. Mark your calendars every Sunday night. This is what we're going to be working on for a total of 12 weeks. It's called the Summer Sampler. And if you haven't noticed, I'm wearing a summer top because I went ahead and went into my attic and pulled out all my summer clothes and cranked up the heat in my house, and I'm pretending like it's summer, even though it's not. I'm pretending like it's summer today. Sometimes I have my own personal summer, also known as hot flashes. And so that's a whole different story. But I love summer. Summertime is my favorite. And so if we work together every single Sunday night, By the time summer gets here, you're going to have one completed top. Somebody said, I love hand quilting. Yes, I do too, and I will have more time to do that. I also love hand applique. I've done an entire king size quilt that was all hand applique, and I love that too. I love hand quilting. I love machine quilting. I guess I love all aspects of quilting. I love piecing. I love trimming. I even love pressing. I don't like pressing my clothes, but I like pressing my quilt blocks. All right. So as you do this over and over again, your brain will develop muscle memory. All right. So now I have all my pieces, and now that I have one quadrant, I'm ready to go over here to my machine, and I'm ready to take these and I'm going to sew them into groups. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to assembly sew. So I'm going to take this, and I know that I have one that goes down and one that goes up, and I'm going to sew them now assembly line sewing. Now let me show you something about these two pieces that I'm about to sew. See how they go like this? If you will take and you lay those on top of each other, and you will make sure that those seams right there are nested and straight, you'll always get nice pieces that match. So always try to nest your seams. And by nesting, I mean where those two seams go opposite directions. And so then I barely tease it. Try not to stretch. And I don't push or pull when I'm sticking that through my machine. So I'm going to go ahead and go over here. And I'm going to run that through my machine. So I know I need to do that a couple of times. So I'm going to assembly line sew these right here. I have two on the bottom. So I'm going to get those two on the bottom. This one goes up. This one goes up. And so I'm going to go ahead and do two blocks together. If you can chain piece, you can get to where you're chain piecing. It saves you a lot of time and a lot of thread. If your sewing machine has one of these that are called pressure adjusters, and this is a Brother PQ 1500. This is an inexpensive machine. It's only like $699. It comes with this extension table and tons of pieces. I'm going to show you how to use this for free motion. But if this machine has a pressure gauge up here that reduces the amount of pressure that your foot puts down on there, reduces the friction, that helps your blocks to also be more accurate because there's not as much friction, so there's not as much stretching of your fabric. And I will do this again. I have another little purple. And I will make sure that these, again, go the same direction. Go up, go down. And so I'm treating these as rows. I'm doing row 1, row 2, row 1, row 2, row 1, row 2. And I'm treating them as rows. I use 100% cotton thread. I clean my machine at least once a month. This is a mechanical machine, so it's easy to do that. So it saves me a ton of money. I'm taking my sewing machine to the mechanic. If you have an expensive machine, and I have those, and you have them serviced, you know how much that can cost. And so by having a piecing machine that I can service myself, I save a ton of money. And if you were with us last night in Zoom, you watched me disassemble this machine and clean it all out, because that's what I did last night. So I clean them out once a month. I make sure that my machine gets oiled. Not all machines require oil. This one does. And I put a fresh needle for every project. If you do that, then your machine will last a lot longer and you will have less frustrations, because a dull needle and a dirty machine can cause you a lot of problems. I'm down to the last one. If you will do me a favor and take a picture of your block and post it on our Facebook page, that would be awesome. You can also post it on Quilt Salons and Challenges. But I want to see what you guys are working on. You guys get to see my project, but I don't always get to see yours. And I would love to be able to see what it is that you're working on. Will you do that for me? Will you go to the Facebook page and post your blocks? I'm really curious as to what everybody else's blocks are going to start looking like. Because the thing about jelly rolls is no matter what jelly roll you use, they end up looking beautiful. All right, so now I have a little string that looks like a clothesline, and these are all of my blocks. So because I did row 1, row 2, row 1, row 2, I can just literally snip in between each of these. I use a seam ripper sometimes instead of scissors. And I can just break that. So this is one block. This is another, and this is a third. And I'm going to go back over here. I'm using this as my reference. And I'm going to take and open that. Make sure I'm going the correct way. Like this. Flipping it down. Pushing those seams. Opposite directions. Pinching it really tight right there. Running my fingernail, making sure that those are nested. I can use a little clip to hold it where I'm going to sew, and I'm going to sew it over here. And I just do all of them really fast. So I will open that up. Open this up. Put them in the direction that they need to go. Looks just like my block. So I'm going to flip these over because they're connected by that little string. So it makes it easy. I don't lose my pieces. If you're doing a large quilt that has a lot of pieces, stringing your blocks together during in-between steps keeps you from losing your pieces, and it keeps the pieces from getting flipped the wrong direction. So here's my next one. Again, they're hanging together, so I can just fillet that open. Just put them together. Again, I just pinch them. Make sure that those seams go opposite directions. Pinch them together right there. My arthritis is definitely getting the better of me as I get older. There's a huge difference between being 30 and 40 and being 40 and 50. And now that I'm climbing towards the a lot more than 50 age group, I'm a member of AARP. I have a side part. According to the internet, side parts are for old ladies, and I am a side part for lifer. I am never going to wear that middle part. You know that thing where people wear that part in the middle? Yeah, that's never going to happen. So I'm of an age group where I'm going to keep wearing my part to the side for the rest of my days. I'm good with that. All right, 1, 2, 3 more. I'm almost ready. Are you guys able to keep up, or am I going too fast? Please let me know. If I'm ever going too fast, can you say, please slow down? Ask me to repeat a step. I will gladly repeat a step. So let's finish up. I have 4 more little blocks to put together. The thing with quilting that makes it more enjoyable is when you are consistent. That's the #1 key of quilting successfully. It's just being consistent, having consistent seams, pressing always to one direction, which is the dark. Making sure that you know how to use your rulers and you know where to square them up. That is the number one tip that I can give you, is just be consistent. And try to stay organized. Having a messy sewing room is very, very exhausting because then you're constantly having to look for things. So clear out your space and have only what you need for that particular project, and then everything else should be out of your way. And then when you're done, put all your pieces away. If you have to stop in the middle of a project and you can't finish it, put it in a little project box and come back for later. I'll show you one of my project boxes. So for example, I have a jelly roll double wedding ring that I'm working. So I have it in a basket. And so this basket has all of my pieces. Every time I get ready to sew, because there's hundreds of these little pieces, there's 144 of this and another one of that. So because I have so many pieces that go with this project and there's so many parts, then I just have a basket. And so when I work on it, I get it out and I lay it out. When I'm not working on it, I put it back in its basket and I stick it on my shelf. You can also, if you have, your project is smaller, you can get little baskets like this. This one is a smaller basket and I have all of my pieces cut out and labeled and ready to go. Or you can just get a bigger bin, depending on how big your project is. If you're working on a king size quilt or whatever, I always keep the name of my jelly roll. So this one is called Breezy or Breeze by Zen Chick. So I have my jelly roll in here. And then I went through my stash. I always keep the little label so I know what jelly roll it is. And I went through my stash and I found all of the fabric that I had that I thought matched that jelly roll, and I threw that in there. And so when I get ready to work on a project, I can find a pattern, put it in this box. I can put a lid on this. And when I cut out all the pieces, I won't lose track of everything that I have in my sewing room, because I have a lot of things in my sewing room. A lot. How about you guys? Do you guys have a lot of stuff in your sewing room? Raise your hand if you are a fabric addict. I am. I love jelly rolls. I love fabric. I love to sew and quilt. I have lots of stuff. All right, friends. This is done. Now I'm going to square those up again, just like I did before. And you'll have to excuse me. My hair is really crazy. If you noticed last time we were together, my hair looked straight because I tried to straighten it. But my hair does its own thing. And the further into the summer we go, the wilder my hair gets. So the more humid, the more my hair grows. So if I start looking crazy, I'm fine. It's just the weather. My hair is like my personal barometer. All right, friends. I have my 4 pieces here. Let me rotate this down so you can see. All over the house, huh, Lynn? All right. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks that look like this. I'm going to get those pressed really quick, and then I'm going to put them together into my finished block and add my sashing. So again, I'm going to take Jack the Ripper on my stiletto, and I'm going to go right here where you see this. I'm going to show you right where you see those stitches. I'm going to break just one of those stitches that's on the other side of my seam line so that I can spiral that seam. And so I'm going to take the seam ripper. I'm going to just take that out. Just like that. I don't want to break this seam too far in. Just one stitch. That's all I'm removing. Taking that one stitch out of there so I can fillet these so they can go opposite directions. Like I said, it makes a little tiny 4 patch. You just tease it with your finger, but don't break any of your stitches because you don't want to have a weak point there. And so now I'm going to mush it and I'm going to press it. I'm going to let those go where they go. And so now my seams are swirling like this. It just makes less bulk in your blocks. Some people don't care which direction their seams go, but I do. I do care which way my seams go. Just makes your life easier. If your seams are not excessively bulky, when you start to machine quilt, you will want your seams to go where they're supposed to go. I'm just going to lay my iron down. If you notice, I'm not scrubbing back and forth. I have a nice point right where I want it. If I measure this, it should measure 4.5 inches. I'll find my ruler, any ruler. And it's a little cattywampus, so I'm going to press it straight. And this has a little tiny sliver that I need to take off of there. As I measure this one, it has a little tiny sliver, and so I'm going to do that in just a second. So I'm going to finish pressing these. Same thing, I'm going to take Jack the Ripper right here, and I'm going to break one stitch, just one. And I'm going to swirl that seam. And that is to reduce the bulk right at that intersection. If you have ever watched Eleanor Burns, one of my favorite people, she has a very famous quilt book called Still Stripping After 25 Years. And she loved jelly roll strips. And so she is one of my quilt heroes. When I was a young woman and quilting on my own, because I learned to quilt when I was in middle school. By a nice lady who used to live next door to my best friend's house, and she was her grandma, and her name was Jenny Sanders. So Jenny Sanders was my quilt friend, my first quilt friend, and then Eleanor Burns, as I became an adult, was pretty popular. She used to have VHS tapes you could buy. So yes, I used to buy VHS tapes. And Eleanor Burns was my quilt teacher back then. I used to also use VHS tapes to videotape Alex Anderson and watch those, because there used to be quilting shows on HGTV. So there we go. There we go. Somebody asked if the free motion class is going to be a Zoom class. It depends on how many people sign up. My Zoom room only has room for 100, and I have over 300 people that said they're interested in that class. So I'm going to have signups, and if we have more than 100 people, then it's probably going to be a YouTube live followed by a question and answer session. Okay. Do you guys need me to show you one more time? Hi from Pittsburgh. Hi, Miranda. So I have one more. Do you guys need me to show you how to swirl that seam before we move on to the last step? So let me show you one more time. I have this and this. So my block is now starting to come together. My little squares are going to face to the inside. And so my star is starting to come together. My final one is on the pattern. This was a dark purple. I could have done it a dark purple, but I didn't want to. I wanted to use up those 4 leftover pieces. And so this is what my star is going to look like. Mine's going to have 4 star legs. And I may or may not put an applique in the middle. I'm not sure. I might do that. I could put a little heart once I'm done and applique a little heart. And so it leaves me some design possibilities. But I like how this is looking. This is how I made mine. So instead of putting a dark purple, I put white in the middle of mine. And so it makes my little star legs float. And so this is just my choice. You can do however you want it. It's your quilt. You are the boss of that quilt. Don't let anybody else tell you how to design your quilt. It's yours and yours alone. There we go. I'm going to swirl that seam. And push it down. And if it won't come, then sometimes it means I didn't break it. You gotta be careful not to pierce your fabric. It's so easy to do with a sharp seam ripper. There we go. So easy to break your seam. Do not break it. There you go. Swirl that little thing. It looks like a 4 patch if you've done it correctly. Try not to stretch stuff too much. There you go. It looks like a little tiny 4 patch. You see a lot of tutorials online, and unfortunately, they go so fast that you don't have a chance to actually see the entire process. So they may show you how to do 1 or 2 things, but they skip a lot of steps. And so I find that actually doing this and taking our time, that you're going to be able to gain some new skills, because each time I do this, I will teach you something a little bit different, and it'll give you the opportunity to see the entire process, not just a portion of it, not just a part of it. We're going to build the entire quilt together. And so we're going to do this across 12 weeks. And I'm also going to show you a variety of settings. So we're going to learn in this series how to set on point, just like the quilt behind me. So if you look at the quilt behind me, that quilt is set on point, and that's a sampler quilt. Those blocks back there are the same size as these blocks right here. So if I wanted to just take this quilt and replace these are exactly the same size back here. So let me look at the chat stream and see if we have any other questions. So what are we saying here? What day is the free motion Zoom class? That one is on March the 20th. It's on a Saturday at 2 o'clock. All of our classes are listed on the Jelly Roll Club Facebook page. So if you go there, that's where I ask members questions, and that's where there's also an event link. So if you will go to at Jelly Roll Club, and let me type it in the chat so that you can see. So let me type it in the chat for you, right? So one word, Jelly Roll Club, just like that, just like our name, is where you go on Facebook. So it's at Jelly Roll Club. When you get there, there's an event link. So click on the top, find the event, and respond to it, because that's how I'm going to monitor how many people we have signed up. And once we hit 100 people that have signed up, then at that point, I'm going to have to move it to YouTube Live. I'd rather do it as a Zoom class so that you guys can ask questions. Okay, now I have my 4. I'm going to check them for size. Get them all trimmed up. This is a 4. That looks straight. All right, how are you guys doing? Are you almost done with your block? I'm almost done with mine. All right. Our free motion quilt class is on a Saturday. Okay. Time to put these babies together. How these are sewn together is the same way that you sew all blocks. So this is just a general rule. So if you take your blocks, you lay them out. Mine go with the white to the inside, white to the inside. I always take and I flip these down like this. My seams have to be nested, so I will nest that seam just like that. So I have less bulk. And that will give me perfect points. I can put a little clip there to hold it. You can put a pin there if you like pinning. I'll just put a little clip there to hold it. I'll take my next one, same thing. We'll nest my seams. And this seam is going this way. And so they're going the same way. I don't like that because it makes it very hard to match your points. And so I'm just going to take and flip the iron. Take the iron, flip it the direction it needs to go and hold it. And I'm just going to lay that on there for a second. No steam. Swirl my little center. Make sure that all of my seams are nice and flat at this point, because then I don't have to come back and keep trying to repress my block. So if I press it correctly the first time, I don't have to keep doing that after. So now I have this. And I have to line them back up. So we'll just look at this and make sure that they go the correct direction. And that one goes in. Don't get them the wrong way. You're going to be really sad if your blocks, you've worked all this time and then you have to seam rip. Again, match those so that they go the correct direction. Put a little clip to hold them in place so I know which side to sew. And to keep them from falling apart, go into my sewing machine. And I'll be right back. And then we will be ready for the sashing. And then this block will be a wrap, friends. I am sewing with a gray thread. Normally you would want your thread to match the rest of your fabric, but I'm doing that so that you can see my stitching. And I'm going to show you guys a little something. When you sew and you have seams that intersect, I want you to see that. You guys see that? And there's a seam that goes this way and a seam that goes that way. You want those seams to cross at exactly the same location. And what that does to your seams is give you those points that are not chopped off. So when I open this and I look at my seams, they're not all cut off. And so my seams are matching but not chopped off. And that's what I want. And now that I have my two halves, I'm going to do the same thing. I haven't pressed those seams. If you notice, those center seams are not pressed because I'm going to take this and I'm going to push one seam one direction and I'm going to push one seam the opposite direction. And I do that so that my center matches. And now I have 1, 2, 3 intersections to match. So I'm going to make sure that those go opposite directions, and that does. And I clip it. That now goes opposite directions in the middle. And I clip it. And I do this when I have a longer length of block to put together. I'm not a pinner. I'm not big on pinning. But I do clip them just to hold it where it needs to go. And then I pull my clips out, which I guess technically is the same as pinning. But I just don't stab myself and bleed all over my fabric. And so there it goes. This middle seam is not pressed. Those other seams are pressed. And I will sew, if you notice all of these seams are going down, I would like to sew with my seams going down on the back side so they don't flip. And that way I can push this down with my stiletto or my finger to make sure that those seams don't get twisted as I sew. So let's give it one last seam, and then this guy is ready to go. are sewing with thread that's a color that's not exactly a match for what you're doing, make sure that you reduce your stitch length so that you can't see those stitches on the other side. All right. Now, this block should measure 8.5 inches. So there's my star. See my star? I'm so excited. I love my little star. It's different than what you saw. The other star had a dark center. If yours has a dark center, that's fine. But my star is done. So I'm going to press it, and now I'm ready to sew my sashing on it. So if you notice our pattern, our star has had a dark middle, and it has this sashing. So I saved my cute blue sashing, and so mine's going to end up looking like this. So I'm going to have a blue sashing. I could still change my mind if I wanted to and put a purple, but I don't think I will. I think I definitely want a blue sashing around mine. And you know what? You're free to change your mind. What if I looked at that and I thought, maybe I just want some red around that. Or maybe I want a slightly darker blue around that. It's up to you. It's your quilt. You're the boss of your quilt. You do whatever you want to do. So maybe I want to do a slightly darker blue. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I might. But in this case, I'm going to stick with my original choice and just go with it. So now I'm going to press my block finally. And I'm going to press it from both the front and the back. If you wanted to press your block with starch, you could, but I find that there's absolutely no need to starch your blocks if you're using like a molded jelly roll. They already come starched. The main thing that you want to do here is that your seams, I'm pushing them down like this, are pushed down, and then you're going to press. So I'm going to just take and just kind of run my finger along some of those seams, just help them lay down so you can tame the beast. Some people will have you fillet your seams open. If you can avoid that, please do. Some of these seams seem a little bit bulky, but that's okay. They're going to be fine. And so now I'm ready to press. I'm just going to lay my iron just carefully on top of that. And I get them to go the direction I want. Just carefully lay my iron on top. I'm not putting any weight on it whatsoever. And the seams will go the way I want them to. And then I'm going to bring this to the front. And I'm going to press that block as flat as I can get it. So I will lay my iron on there. And I will press that block flat. Trying not to distort it. There's a lot of bias in this, so it's easy to do. So I'm going to press my block in all directions, trying to keep it as flat as I can and not distort it. I like it when my points match. This one is the little cattywampus here. I'm just going to press that seam open. Sometimes it's just you're pressing the seam in the wrong direction, so it looks a little cattywampus. This one is a nice match, and so I just have to make sure in the back that my seam is straight. And this one just went off kilter just a hair. So when I was sewing, it looks like I went zoom, just a hair, a little too fast. So I can take that back over to my sewing machine and sew just a little bit more if I wanted to straighten out. But actually, it's so minute that I'm not too worried about it, and it'll be just fine. And so I'm just going to press that flat. But I always check and inspect my seams as I go. And I just kind of press it down, and now my block is feeling really flat. I have 2 long pieces now for my sashing and 2 shorts. So I'm going to sew this on the top and on the bottom. These are 8.5 inches, so I'm going to check, and ooh, look at that block, exactly 8.5. I'm going to check this one, 8.5, and look, it's off like a hair, not even a 16th. So this means that my block is pretty accurate. I don't have any trimming because it looks like it's pretty straight. So I'm going to flip this down and flip this down. And I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew it up. I'm going to sew that. I'll be right back. And if you notice, I sewed down one side. So I literally just sewed down one side this way. And I'm going to take my block and I'm going to pull the thread and I'm going to rotate it. And I'm going to sew it down the other side. I'm going to sew on the opposite side. I find that by sewing opposite directions, whether it's a strip set or sashing or whatever, it keeps your pieces square and true. And it keeps them from getting lost. Your feed dogs pull your fabric every single time, so your feed dogs do this to pull the fabric through, and what happens is it starts shifting your pieces. So you end up, instead of ending something that's square, you end up with a little bit of a trapezoid, parallelogram, or whatever my math teacher would have called that. All right, voila. Now I'm ready for the other sashing, the top and the bottom. Which direction am I going to press? I'm going to press towards the sashing. So I just took my hands and I smoothed that out towards the sashing. I could give it a quick little press, make those flat. And I'm going to add my top and bottom sashes the same way. I'm going to have a tiny bit left over because these were a tiny bit bigger than what they needed to be, which is okay. So now I've got these, and I'll come over here to sew. Same thing. Line it up with that edge. This is going to hang over just a hair, which is fine. Do not panic, because here at the end, I'm going to give it a little trim. If you ever have two pieces of fabric and one is a tiny, just a hair bit longer, put that side on the bottom and it will shrink it up enough that those two pieces will match. People are not perfect, and sometimes when you're cutting, you can be off by even just a 30/2 of an inch or something. Sometimes it's just the smallest bit. So this goes that way. And I'm going to take and rotate that block. And then I'm going to sew in the opposite direction. So I just stitched it this way. Now I'm going that way. Always in the opposite direction. If you want to participate in events related to the Jelly Roll Club, you should like our Facebook page, follow us on YouTube so that you will get notices. I'm a member of Quilt Alongs and Challenges, and so I'll post stuff there. But if you ever want to know what's happening, we have a website. The The website is www.jellyrollclub.com. Our YouTube channel is Jelly Roll Club. And our Facebook page is called Jelly Roll Club. And my email is Ivonne at Jelly Roll Club. So here we go, friends. Voila. There's my block. I'm going to press it. And now I'm going to square it up. Square it up. Here's a pressing tip. If you have a block like this, instead of just pushing sideways, I come in at a slight angle like this and press. Then I rotate and I come in at a slight angle like this and press. And the reason I do that is because I want to keep my corners good and square. So I don't want them to become distorted. And so then once that happens, then I can press sideways just like that. Again, laying my iron. Today I'm using a full-size iron that my people use from time to time for whatever they use an iron for. I don't think I've pressed a pair of pants in probably 22 years, and I'm okay with that. Who presses their clothes anymore anyway? Everybody just wears slouchy joggers. There we go. I'm pressing gently to the outside. Equal in every direction or even in every direction. And there's my block, good and flat. Ta-da! So now I'm going to measure it. See, I have a tiny bit at the top of those two because they were a little bit longer. So now I'm just going to square those up with my 12.5-inch ruler, which I have around here somewhere. So if you don't own a 12.5-inch ruler, this is one of my favorite rulers. I have a lot of rulers, but I use this one. I use my 2.5-inch and my little Missouri Star 2.5-inch strip ruler a lot. I use them quite a bit. And so those are my rulers that we use. So let's go. And this is what we've got here. So I'm going to lay this here and I'm going to line this up with one of the lines so that I can see what I need to trim. I'm going to line this up to make it straight, and then I'm going to slide it over. And I'm going to trim the excess that I have on this side only. So I'm going to take and trim those two little tails off. And then I'm going to rotate this around because I'm always cutting away from myself. And my ruler is 12.5 inches, and this block is exactly 12.5 inches. So that means I had a consistent seam, and things worked out the way they were supposed to work out. So once I trim these little pieces off, I'm not going to have, this is all that I had to trim off of mine, I'm not going to have to change the size. If your blocks are 12, then trim them all to 12. And so now I have two blocks for my summer sampler. This is block 1. We did that last week. If you missed that class, you can go back. It's on YouTube. I uploaded it later. And then this is block 2. So now I have 2 blocks for my summer sampler, and I'm ready for next week. So it is 10 o'clock. I'm going to sign off, and then I'm going to open a Zoom room for about 15 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes. That way you can ask questions after class. So I'm going to get off of here. I hope you have a wonderful night. I'll see you next Sunday for block number 3 of the summer sampler. You can find that on our website at www.jellyrollclub.com. I do this for fun. I'm not trying to sell you anything. You have nothing to buy. Jelly Roll Club activities are always free. I hope you have a great night. I will see you in the Zoom room in just a few minutes. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye. Go to Jelly Roll Club on Facebook if you want to get on Zoom with us. Goodbye.